Hi, and welcome back to NewsReal with Joe and Neil.
I'm Joe.
I'm Neil. It's 2019. Happy New Year, everyone. Joe, what are we going to be talking about this year?
This year?
Yes, all year long.
You want me to look into my crystal ball, do a bit of scrying? Trump and the deep state, obviously.
Obviously,
that's all that we've been talking about for the past
Still,
2
he
years.
has 2 years to go, plus 4 more if his cocky predictions turn out to be correct.
I think we'll be talking about how the walls are closing in on Trump, you know?
Not that wall.
No, not the wall, but
Right.
the walls are closing in and that bombshells have been dropped.
Oh, yes.
And he's about to be impeached and eventually, come, what is it, 2 years from now, so 2021, November 2021, they'll say...
November 2020, I think. But yes,
November 2020,
the new term would be 2021.
November 2020, yeah, when another election comes up, there'll be a bombshell. Trump, not to win second term. We told you he was going out. We told you it would end all the way through
Our
the past
final
4
poll, 95% against Trump.
95% support Oprah Winfrey.
Who's running? They say
his
this.
opponent.
What's her name? Massachusetts Senator Warren. Elizabeth Warren's running for 2022.
Pocahontas, yeah.
Good luck.
Who knows? We'll have to wait and see. We can't do any scrying. We just know that things are going to be crazy and get crazier. There's no sign that the media war machine will ever back off on its love and support for endless war and American exceptionalism. So, yeah, expect that to continue, assuming that something doesn't intercede to upset the apple cart, let's say. But we'll have to wait and see, unfortunately.
Well, Trump managed to keep himself in the news throughout the holidays. Something else that kept going was the situation in France. I mean, the media, Anglophone, international media, pretty much overlooked it. And so you would think that it has just restarted. I'm talking about the Yellow Vest protests in Paris and elsewhere in France. It didn't actually end. They kept it going throughout. Maybe there were smaller numbers. It got a lot colder in France the last week or so. But that didn't stop people protesting. It's been now 8 consecutive weeks. Yes, since mid-November. Maybe it's picked up again a notch yesterday. Act VIII, they called it. We have got a couple of videos. We should probably play them. The one that's going around, this is a pretty interesting scene. This is a scene on a bridge in the center of Paris. It seems that what they were trying to do yesterday was head for the Assemblée Nationale, which is France's parliament, and protest outside there. But they were stopped from crossing 2 pedestrian bridges in front of it, crossing the Seine in Paris. Can we play that video of the bridge? Which one is it now? Yeah, that's the one. Let's just have a look at this. It's a smaller scale, but you know what it reminded me of? The scenes in Cairo 8 years ago, almost to the day in January 2011, when protesters and riot police in Cairo fought this running pitch battle, especially over a bridge. It's different in scale. That was a large 2-lane highway in Cairo, and police vans were just simply running over people. It got really bad. But this is getting pretty close to that kind of pitch, where they're battling and the police are, on occasion, in retreat. We saw a pretty close approximation to. We know what happened in Cairo after that. I mean, the government did fall. The situation got co-opted in the end, and it more or less reverted to the status quo in Egypt. But it was still it was full on what you would definitely say is a revolution, a popular revolution. So between that kind of image from yesterday and some other things, I think on just before Christmas, a video went round where gendarmes it looked like they first provoked the protesters, I think on the Champs-Élysées, somewhere in the centre of Paris. But then they lost control of the situation because they were being attacked, counterattacked. And one of them drew out his gun. He didn't fire it, it seems, but that's, again, another hint of how close... Once you start having to fire at people, or like in Cairo, start just simply running over crowds and crushing people, then the situation, you've lost control of the situation. It's still relatively in control, in quotes, but it's getting close. I think I read that another person died yesterday. A woman was hit. Again, you'd have to put these things down to accident and not yet intention on the part of the security forces. But a woman was hit with a flashbang or possibly one of these smoke grenades, but it hit her in the head and it killed her, I believe. That would make it the 10th or 11th victim since the protests began.
Well, France is the only country in the EU to use those flashbangs or, explosive, essentially grenades. They're meant to, scare people and to hurt their ears, basically, but it's the only country in the EU that actually uses them. They're pretty violent weapons, and sure, they don't kill people. They're non-lethal crowd control devices, but for the most part, in the sense that as long as you don't get hit directly by one. But if you get hit directly by one, as you've just mentioned,
they pack sufficient concussion potential.
They're lethal, yeah. So this is pretty serious state repression when the police have been okay to use those devices, when I'm pretty sure every other country in Europe doesn't. They're not authorized for use by police against protesters, when these are effectively normal protesters. And you see images of the yellow vests kind of punching and attacking cops and all that kind of stuff, but the cops are doing that to them. There's no clear kind of moral high ground here. The cops decide that they don't want people to move in a certain direction, so they start beating them, right, to beat them back. Are the protesters then not allowed to use similar level of violence against the police? They have to denounce that. I mean, it's not clear. The state mouthpieces, the state itself and the state mouthpiece and the media and stuff would like to present that as this violence, and Macron explicitly has said this violence against police is unacceptable. But police are using violence against protesters, and it's not very clear that violence is justified. Why? Because the police don't want the protesters to go in a certain direction. Why? Is that justified? They don't want them to get anywhere near the Elysee. Why? Because they'll destroy it? Well, that's not clear. Maybe they just want to be outside the Elysee and they want to protest. So let them go up to the Elysee and let them protest outside the Elysee. And if then they try to, there's a plausible argument that when people start destroying private property, that they should be stopped from doing that.
Physically stopped.
Physically stopped. But when they want to move in a certain direction and be at a certain place, there's no plausible reason why you shouldn't allow them to be there, except on your assumption that they're going to be, they're going to destroy property when they get there.
Yeah.
So
it's not a clear-cut issue, but
but the media would like to make it very clear.
Yes, it's simply that they're violent.
The moral.
We'll get to the media in a minute. The narrative they've been pumping out in the French media in the last month has gone really full bore in one direction. But just before we do so, there's another video I want to play from yesterday also, which again hints at just how close the waves of revolution are lapping to the surface here. This is a video of a side street, also central Paris. Not the bridge scene. It's a scene. This is it. These guys have commandeered a forklift. And that is the entrance to a government ministry.
Now, you notice they didn't all run in there and start looting the place.
Or going in and cutting heads off.
It's a symbolic move to knock down the doors type thing,
Yeah. It's hilarious. I'm not supposed to say that. Sorry, no, we don't condone this type of violence or activity, but come on, that's funny. It's still at the level of being funny. As the protesters said, somebody among their representatives now, their spokespeople, they published a letter saying, a number of things. They obviously reframed their grievances and what they would like to see and so on. But the core phrase that I remember from it was that, listen, if there's no yielding on our demands from the government, logically anger will turn into hatred and you will see actual bloodshed. I don't think that's intended as a threat. The government's reading it the other way, of course. This is all a threat from start to finish. But objectively, that's true. There is only so long that action and counteraction can go on, so long as both sides remain implacable before something serious happens. In that case, it's being reported as a government finance ministry. It wasn't quite that. It's affiliated. The literal translation into English is the Ministry for Links Between Parliament and Government. So some sub-agency or whatever, some government ministry. The guy actually in charge of that department, he said that he and his aides had to be hurriedly evacuated to a safe place. They're obviously hamming up the threat, but as you saw, there was no real threat. They bashed down the doors and they left it at that. He said that he was at his desk that afternoon, yesterday, when the Yellow Vests smashed the gate down, as you saw with the forklift. Although they claimed that they went on to break some more windows and that the ministry's cars are now unusable. So they may have done a little bit more than just use a forklift. But that's that's
the guy said he was at his desk yesterday.
Right. Well, some people work on Saturdays.
A French government functionary working on Saturday?
He could have been making that up. But he claims the story is that he and any other staff who were with him had to be evacuated from the baying horde. The thing with this is, this is the reason why they didn't want the protesters going to the Elysee Palace. And now, why they're keeping them from going to the Parliament, because they're worried that they're going to storm the place. And then there was, if you remember, even by late November, they're saying, no, we want Macron to resign. We're all going to the Elysee Palace to make Macron resign. Now, the government's going to read that as a physical threat. We now know that they did, because just before Christmas, it emerged that Macron had a military helicopter on standby within the grounds of the Elysee Palace in the event of a need for an emergency evacuation. That's how seriously they're taking the threat. The irony is that they might make that threat a reality, but not because that's the exact intention of the protesters as things stand. You can see how it would spiral to, creating your own reality where you would have a serious situation and people need to be airlifted before they're killed. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's how close things are. That's how tense things are. The protesters aren't backing down, and the government, through its mouthpieces, are. This is what I was referring to earlier. The messaging is, initially there was some contrition. You remember Macron gave a national address on TV, and there was a little bit of sorry and a lot of castigating of the extreme elements. Well, now they've gone full bore, and they're characterizing the movement as a whole, or implying that it's on the whole a movement of anti-Semites, full-bore racists, homophobes, Jew haters, which is covered by anti-Semites and so on. They're really like going with the attempt to catapult the propaganda to win back this situation by just lying about it. It's a totally losing battle in a country where for the last 2 months, millions of people have literally been hanging out with each other at roundabouts, town squares, city centres, and talking to each other and sharing their views and remaining consistent. Government polls today, just last week, so polls they'd hoped that you could maybe doctor and mostly get, the middle class voice to say the right thing and therefore churn out the right result. No, the government mandated polls still show 3/4 of the population of France supports the Yellow Vest movement, despite all the violent scenes we've seen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're united in their, like you said, they talk to each other. They have been talking to each other on the streets. Basically, it's a grassroots movement, and it's people of every stripe, of every ideological or political affiliation. and they're all united in their distaste, their extreme, let's say, distaste for the policies of the Macron government and what he stands for. And of course, we talked previously about what he stands for. He stands for a kind of globalist agenda that ultimately puts the interests of rich people above the interests of the ordinary people in many different ways. That happens, but that's the general problem, you know. So people can say, generally French people they don't care about, you know, the different policies. They're not going to take a stance on any particular one. They're basically saying that all of those policies are bad for the French people, for the vast majority of ordinary French people, and that's what unites them. And of course, Macron, you know, he's not a very likable character. You can totally understand why the French people feel this way about him, and it's heartening to see that level of unity amongst the ordinary French people. You know, where in other countries they tend to be a lot more divided, and it's heartening to see that they can narrow their perspective down to simply an intolerance, let's say, of corruption, of government corruption, and unite. And of course, Macron came in for, I mean, it hasn't been a good couple of months for Macron because of these protests, but also because over the Christmas period another kind of scandal came back to bite him. This is a guy called Benalla, who was Macron's government a kind of advisor, let's say, to Macron. He hit the headlines earlier last summer, when he was caught on video out beating the heads of different protesters.
Right, that was on May 1st, yeah.
He came out, he decided he would, you know, he's Macron's kind of confidant, is probably the best way to describe him. He's got a lot of murky stuff going on, but he's a close confidant of Macron's. He's a guy of Algerian, I think, extraction, and he apparently had a lot of power, got a lot of privileges in the Elysee and the government from Macron, and in July last year, he was caught on video out joining in with the police. He's not a policeman, but he was joining in with the security forces, beating the heads of protesters. You know, he donned a helmet and got a stick and started beating some protesters, and that caused a lot of. It was a scandal at the time, and he was supposedly let go. He was dismissed from whatever position he held. But then it turned out that within the last month or so, he had been taking trips on a French diplomatic passport. This same guy with bigwig businessmen to do more or less arms deals in Africa, largely on behalf of both the French government and French corporations, and there's not much difference between the two, really. So he was still acting in
an official capacity.
Yeah, under the authority of the state by carrying this diplomatic passport. And it turned out that after he was let go in July because he was beating protesters, he actually got issued another diplomatic passport. So he had two, the one that he had while he was employed, and then when he got fired, 3 weeks after he got fired, someone walked up to him from the government, we don't know the name of the person on the street, and said, gave him another diplomatic passport and said, don't do anything stupid with it. So he decided...
And we know this because he went on TV last week to defend himself and divulge these details.
He said all this to French media outlet. He gave an interview. But this is the guy who last July, when after he was fired in the first scandal, Macron had to come out and make a statement about him. And Macron probably lied, but he said that this guy Alexander Benalla never had the nuclear codes, which was one of the allegations that he had. That he never had a 300 square meter apartment in the presidential annex at the Element in the Elysee. Mm-hmm. And Macron also explicitly said that Alexander Benalla was never my lover.
Oh.
So Macron said this publicly in July. Now, like, when you get to the point where you have to publicly state that you're a man and a president, that person was never my lover, you're better off saying nothing, because you're such an idiot to even address that, because the fact that you have to address that means that everybody thinks that it's true anyway. Right. And they're not going to believe when you say that it's not the case.
Don't ever believe anything until it's officially denied, right?
I'd say I would give a 90% chance, 90% probability that, first of all, I think that most French people or anybody who's been watching it knows is that Emmanuel Macron is gay, but denies that he is, and maintains the charade that he's married to his former teacher, who is 20 plus years his senior. And and also that this guy Alexander Benalla was one of Macron's lovers. So it's just, I mean, it just doesn't look good for the guy at all. And he really should resign. Macron really should resign in the interest. If he claims he's interested, or he has the best interest of the French Republic at heart, he really should go, because he's roundly despised.
It's incredible. He's such tainted goods, and it's only 18 months into it.
Yeah,
jeepers creepers. Everything he does and says. It's the small things he says. That's why this exploded in such a fashion. It's an accumulation of a year and a half. Now it's an accumulation of 4 decades, as he said in his somewhat contrite speech to the nation. It's an accumulation of decades of abuse of the French people. But the specific charge that detonated was his entry.
Right, and he's not the guy to correct it. It may be 4 years or 4 decades old, but he's not the guy to come along corrected with his his superficial pandering to kind of liberal values, and especially in the context of him as a person, as a personality. He's this young guy. He's barely 40 years old. He has very little experience in politics. He doesn't encourage or elicit kind of a sense of trust or confidence in him as a person, basically, because of his age, and because also he was chosen to unite the country, let's say, by powerful banking interests behind him, to try and essentially con the French people into thinking that this was a new era of prosperity, and he was going to, he's a young guy, he's more in touch with the people, but he's actually shown that he's massively out of touch with the people. And why? Because he's nothing more than a puppet. He's simply doing the bidding of people who do not have the interest of the French people at heart. And Emmanuel Macron can do nothing about that. And he has taken on the role of puppet to basically do the bidding of other people. So when you do that, you can't expect that people aren't going to see through you, especially when it comes to people as kind of relatively perspicacious as the French people are compared to other people. French people have kind of, generally speaking, as a collective, have a good head on their shoulders, let's say. And they're going to see through you when you are in the reality of the situation. You are a puppet, and you are not making sovereign decisions. You're doing the bidding of other people. You're not going to be able to stop that coming through.
Yeah.
And the French people are going to see it, and they're going to protest the way they're protesting. So unless Macron has a choice, he can either decide to be his own person and cut ties with his backers, which obviously really isn't possible, or he needs to resign. And they need to come up with someone better, so a better foil, if you know what I mean, a better look, let's say, someone with more gravitas, more sincerity, and someone who also has the power to actually do the things that the French people want. But at this point in France and in the Western world, I don't think that's possible.
I think it's
really
lost.
Anywhere.
It's lost.
Except in countries, maybe smaller countries like, that have gone towards the right, if you know what I mean, towards nationalistic ideals, like in Hungary and Poland. But the problem with those countries is that they're largely hamstrung by the EU. There's a limit to how much freedom they have to exert on the direction of the country. So it's not looking good for anybody in European countries.
When Benalla went on TV this week to defend himself after he's just caught having been in Africa while Macron was there doing the American thing, where the president goes to spend Christmas Day or New Year's Day, something like that, with the troops on a French military base in Chad, which the protesters are like, that's one of their grievances. What the hell are we doing in all these countries? He thought it wise to speak up for and defend Macron in the process by saying that Macron has to deal with, quote, phenomenal bullshit.
Yep. And
described his presidency as a curatorship. This is to defend the guy. And you know where he's coming from. He's like, oh, geez, people, okay, you don't understand the pressure he's under from behind the scenes. Right. He's just divulging and confirming what everyone knows, that he's a puppet. And he's damned if he does and damned if he doesn't.
Didn't he say in an interview as well that there were people making Macron do certain things? Do you have the...
I don't have the full quote. That's the choice words, but yes, that was
He
exactly
said
what was
explicitly that there are
articulated.
people making him do things that are just complete bullshit.
Making him do phenomenal BS
Yeah.
on TV this week, and that's basically giving the game away while trying to defend the guy.
Yeah, not helping.
And not helping the Macron or his backers,
To keep a facade up.
and confirming that he must have in some way a gun to his head. Maybe not so literally, but the threat of blackmail.
But of course he has has a gun to head. He's entirely a creation of finance. I mean, this is actually public knowledge as well. The people, essentially banking interests and powerful corporate interests, who created Emmanuel Macron as a presidential candidate, created his party, and made him president. So and Macron knows that, obviously. So in that position, he has no room to maneuver at all. He's president of France because someone else wanted him to be. So he has to do. He sold his soul, basically. You know what I mean? For that little bit of power of being president, and of essentially just being the spokesman for other people, like we keep saying. So yeah, I don't think talking about people not lasting their term, like the U.S. and Western media has been going on about Trump for the past 2 years. Any minute now, he's going to be impeached. It's much more likely that would be a better refrain for Macron. I don't think Macron's going to last. Particularly if these protests keep up, that he's going to last. The next 3 years. But
at this point, even a careful, in quotes, replacement won't last either. I mean, the protesters, they're being criticized, they're being attacked for being racist, homophobes, and all that stuff. But when the chattering classes are being more prosaic about things, they're criticizing them for having no mandate, for having no political organization, for having no... What are your demands? We're hearing a million screaming voices and you're not blah, 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 blah. That's BS. It's very coherent. It's very coherent on social media. It's very coherent when those who've stepped forward to be spokespeople have gone on TV in France, left, right, French, rural, city dweller, of Arab extraction, whoever, all of them are on board. And they all come to this one topic. You see it in the protesters' slogan, their banners, if you watch carefully the live feeds of the protest, you'll see what it is. You'll see most commonly RIC, the initials RIC. That basically stands for, in English, a Popular Referendum Initiative. It's the one thing, it's a very discreet and clear political goal. But they're not going to address it. Oh, they have. That's not entirely true. The Prime Minister did say, so that would be under Macron, Philippe Edouard, he did say we will consider this, but only in limited ways. We'll have a debate about it in 2019. But they know damn well that he's trying to fudge and that they will not give him what they want.
That's direct democracy.
Direct democracy.
A referendum. They want people to vote on important issues. That you don't just have the politicians making the decision themselves, but you put it to the people. Yes,
you put some to the people. And in 4 areas: constitutional, the power to change a law, the power to propose a law, and the power to evoke the position of a minister. So you might get 500,000 signatures, and then there will be a national referendum on anything. And because it has X number of signatures, it's going to be of general interest to the population, and therefore important. But right there, you can see why that would overturn the whole way democracy has gone in the West, especially in Europe, especially under the EU, and in Western Europe, especially within the EU, because right there you would have almost certainly, if not a revocation, a removal, a Frexit, then something close to it. You would have right there a rejection of France's being a signatory to the UN Mass Migration Compact. You would have an end to austerity measures. You would have an end to bailing out the banks. It's the whole package. You would have the whole package of the overall agenda that unites the so-called left and right within, really, it's all one establishment voice. It would all be overturned. Maybe not overnight, but in rather quick time. So that's why they do not actually engage the debate. They do not address it, and they certainly do not yield to that political demand, which is a very well articulated demand. It's very smart too, because it's uniting people. It's not taking any one issue and getting into the nitty, the splitting off, whether you're pro-migrant or anti-migrant. Well, let's deal with that when we get the means to have the proper
vote.
What's the vote? Oh, well, there it is. It's 65% against.
Mm-hmm.
Be that okay? So most French people are racist. We're just going to have to live with it.
But that's not the case.
It's so interesting because this is exactly the system that France's francophone neighbour, Switzerland, has. They speak other languages there too, but Switzerland has had this form of direct democracy since 1848, when it's arguably the last time we had these kinds of protests / revolutions Europe-wide, and maybe even further than that. You remember it was even in Ireland. It was the Young Irelanders, the United Irishmen was the year before, but that was a prefix that often went with whenever it kicked off in the next country. You were the young something. That gave rise to the Young Turks in Turkey and so on. 1848. Well, that's the year since Switzerland yielded at that time to that popular demand, and has been functioning, everyone will agree, superbly since then. They've had something like, it's not been crazy either. One of the criticisms is, oh, Jesus, if you have a referendum on every issue, sure, we'll never get anything done. No, they've had about 600, about 3 per year, I think. And sometimes it's yes, sometimes it's no. And then things just move on. Like a recent one they had was 2 recent ones. Now, you might think the elites would go, oh, Jesus, no, we can't be having that, or there'll be socialism everywhere on the one side. So, for example, Switzerland had one about whether or not to introduce a minimum basic income. This is different than a basic wage or a minimum social welfare. Everyone gets a salary, period, no matter what they do. The Swiss voted against it. So that naturally, the body politic tamped down the demands of the left, right? Okay, that's one issue. In the same year, I think they were both last year, they had another one, something about an expansion of the building of mosques. And maybe it was more particular. It was, do we allow mosques to build minarets in which they would blare out the morning call to prayers? I think it was specific like that. And a clear majority said no. So that's something of the right. You know, there's both issues, and the people decide, and then that's the end of it.
Right, but that means that this left-right divide is really phony, and that when it comes to real issues, people are united and they know what's good for them because they're the ones who live in the country and they're the ones who, basically...
The crowd can be dangerous, but it can also be wise.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that those demands of the Yellow Vests in France of that direct democracy, like referendums, people's referendums on major issues, is a very appropriate response to the problems in the French government right now, which is that there is no representation. There effectively is no democracy. I know people have always said that democracy isn't perfect and blah, blah, and it's only been democracy in Western countries don't only ever really been limited democracy and stuff. But at this point in many Western countries, there's no democracy whatsoever. Because, the idea of democracy is that people elect certain individuals to government and you entrust them you elect specific people based on what they've said they'll do, what their ideology is, and you pick the best person to lead you, essentially, including the parliamentarians, and then you assume that you've made a right choice, and they'll get on with doing either they know exactly what the people want, or by people explicitly voicing it, or they intuit they have the best interest of the people at heart, and they will enact policies that they know are for the good of the country. And it's not hard to know what policies are good or what policies are bad for civil society, for people. And that's a basic idea of democracy. So you entrust that authority to those people. But the problem in France and in other European countries today is that those people are beholden to other interests that are not in the interest of the ordinary people. So there's no actual representation of the interests of the ordinary people in government in European countries, in most European countries today. So there's no democracy whatsoever. You have an oligarchy, essentially. Yeah. They decide what they want to do, and very often what they decide to do is in their interests, and very often that's against the interests of or runs counter to the interests of the ordinary people.
I can think
the
of
only solution to that situation is to say, listen, we need to take back power by mandating some kind of a direct vote by the people on major issues.
Yeah.
So it's it's not even socialist in that respect. It's a correction to the problem. It's the only reasonable, rational correction to the problem of no representation for the people in government.
I can think of one exception where an instance where a democracy has yielded on a course correction. Trump's election.
Right.
Now it's debatable because you say, well, he had powerful backers too, and maybe there's some backroom deals where they went, oh God, it looks like he's going to be elected. We'll go with it, and then we'll hamstring him every which way we can. That's debatable. But at least on basic outward appearances, the elites in the US were completely blindsided, or substantially blindsided, and then shocked by the result, and then went in to try to tamp it down and keep it crippled and sclerotic after the fact. But at least in principle, you have the basic fundament of a democracy, which is that the reason we've gone into democracies and republics as opposed to monarchies of old is because when corruption becomes entrenched, there has to be a mechanism to yield. It's a safety guard against bloody revolutions and wars. That's why we all went in that direction. In theory, it's a bit like why the European Union was founded, because we want to stop wars. That's a good, sound, fundamental principle to start
But it's been
with.
subverted as well.
It got subverted.
Because
And
every time you change
they
the guard,
they thought
they get the
could-
same people.
They could lock it up with lobbyists and buy corporate interests, control the media, and will shape it, will influence people how to think and how to vote. But then they got surprised on the once. And in fairness, they did yield. Trump became the president of the United
But
States.
then they've done everything they possibly can to
Yeah.
make sure he can't do anything.
In Europe, I don't think the old guard, they're not going to yield one bit. I mean, Macron, because look, so much depends on it, the whole edifice. If France is the EU, it's like if Germany were to cave into a popular uprising and fundamentally reorient its policies. It would be curtains for the EU as currently constituted anyway. So it's the same with France. The two biggest countries, the EU is, like I mentioned, partially kept together by the guiding original idea of keeping France and Germany from not killing each other anymore. So, if France goes, so much else can go with it.
Yeah. There's another kind of, I suppose, related story to this, the politics and the protests in France and in other European countries, and also in the political situation in America in the past couple of years. There's a website called jihadwatch.org, and it's been around since 2003. It's run by a guy called Robert Spencer. Robert Spencer is an American, and he's basically been accused of being an Islamophobe, and he's written many books. His latest book is called The History of Jihad, From Muhammad to ISIS. And I suppose that title should give you an idea of what his shtick is. But on his Jihad Watch website, earlier this year actually, he was banned from Patreon for Islamophobia, etc. And it's kind of interesting, as an example of just how convoluted the dynamics are in terms of the left-right divide and, pro-immigration and anti-immigration and, the rise of nationalism and as a response to extremist leftist values being pushed, etc. Because obviously there are other people. It's interesting that this guy would then be lumped in, because he was banned by Patreon. Other people recently who've been banned by Patreon are other right-wing.
Carl Benjamin,
Sargon of Akkad, and a few other people actually. And it seems to be a trend, and people are predicting that more and more people will be banned from these revenue-generating websites, and thereby preventing them from earning an income and effectively in that way silencing them. But I just wanted to discuss a little bit about this idea of the left and right divide and what's on the right and what's on the left, and how, again, like I said, how complicated and complex the whole situation is, and how you need to think very carefully and not be pulled into a kind of polarization to one or the other, because in those situations you find yourself kind of based on your ideology, based on your what could be said to be an objective view of a situation, you can end up being damned if you do and damned if you don't. And it's very hard to eke out a little bit of middle ground or centre ground these days with so many people polarised to the left or the right. If you're anti-immigration today,
you are on the right, and you basically buy the story that
right,
all these terror attacks are done by Muslims to us because they hate us for our freedoms,
right,
a la George Bush.
Right. The problem is with this guy in particular, Robert Spencer, who has this book, The History of Jihad from Muhammad to ISIS. Obviously the agenda of demonizing Muslims, being Islamophobic, is very much in the domain of an Israeli agenda, historically in the Middle East, of demonizing Muslims. So there are a lot of people who, see what, even on the right, who would normally be on the right, let's say, who see what Israel is doing, like to the Palestinians, for example, and then would tend to take an anti-Israel stance in that respect of Israeli aggression in the Middle East and against Muslims in general. You tend to guard against that, because you end up being a pro-Israeli, and Israel is objectively responsible for, slow genocide against Palestinians, and it's certainly hasn't been a force for good in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. But if you take that tack, then you find yourself almost by definition on the side of the left, right?
Yeah.
You would be accused of being a lefty. I mean, there was the most recent female Muslim congresswoman who's newly elected recently. She's very much anti-Trump. So, if you let me see if I can get my head around this. Basically, you end up being pro-immigrant.
Yeah.
Or essentially, because most of the immigrants to Europe are Muslim, you end up then being pro-Muslim.
Yeah.
Which goes against your traditional conservative values, or traditional conservative outlook, let's say, in that a lot of people who are conservative in Europe and in the US today don't want mass immigration.
Okay.
You know what I'm saying? So basically, it's very difficult these days to navigate, and that's why you find people being polarized to left or right side, and oversimplifying situations, because it's very complex, and you have to be able to say, in this specific situation, I support this, but in this specific situation, I support this, and in doing that, you can effectively be taking both sides. You can be identifying with right wing values, and you can be identifying at another time with left wing values, and that's why we really don't like this left and right divide, and see it as a setup to polarize people and to essentially, ultimately, potentially encourage civil conflict.
Yeah.
Particularly in European countries, but also in the US, where there's a lot of kind of minorities and people of who don't necessarily identify as American, let's say, or not Christian, let's say, But particularly in Europe, in France, there's 15% of the population are technically Muslim, or from of foreign extraction, let's say, mostly North Africa. So that's one of the things that's heartening. Getting back to the Yellow Vest protests, one of the things that's heartening is that there hasn't, that divide that has been attempted to divide people hasn't really taken hold in France, which it could very easily do, because, like I said, there's a big Muslim population in France, and with 17 years of the war on terror and so many Muslim terror attacks, or so-called Muslim or ISIS terror attacks in France, you can imagine that a scenario where a lot of French people are against would be turning against Islam and certainly would be against immigration. But that scenario obviously, like I said, has the potential for creating social strife or social conflict between people who are officially French citizens, people at each other's throats effectively while the state gets away with its corruption. And that's why it's very heartening to see Yellow Vests protests directing their anger at government, government corruption. They're not going to be fooled by, or not going to be pulled into fighting with their neighbours, but rather fight against the government.
It's all the more remarkable that this has not taken hold as expected, as you might expect, in France, because they have had for a long time this large minority population of Muslim or people from the Maghreb, Middle East, North Africa extraction. And they've had obviously a concerted number of effort, I suppose, on behalf of the spooks to have terror attacks, really big ones in Paris. Obviously in 2015, it was a big year. But there were a few incidents before that. And obviously a lot of minor, relatively smaller ones since then. But that's partly why the confluence of the two things in early December was astonishing, because you had a terror attack in Strasbourg, one of the cities where people are protesting, right in the middle of it. Now, they didn't ham it up too much. It went away fairly quickly after a week in the media here. It was the largest terror attack in the West in the whole of 2018. Boom, in the middle of a situation where the government is at chronic risk of destabilization, of being overthrown, ISIS appears. And French people were like, you've got to be kidding me. What is the chance? What are the odds of that? Oh, well, it was just a random guy. Oh, so it's random chance. Is it seriously? I don't think people bought it. But over the longer term, they haven't bought it either, which is all the more remarkable, you would think. And it's interesting because ISIS did declare, they made all these statements like in 2014 before the big terror attacks, the Charlie Hebdo and the Paris attacks, how they were going to go after France. There was some declarations were made about how France was key because it was secular or some BS like that. No, because it was such fertile ground, having such a large minority Muslim population. I think the thing you were trying to get at earlier, it's the danger of falling into one or the other and then framing all the other issues today and across time within that context you've fallen into. So, for example, the title of this guy Spencer's book, say it to me again.
The history of jihad from Muhammad to ISIS. Right,
from Muhammad to ISIS. It's all one story.
Yeah.
ISIS today, obviously horrible. Islam in its early days, obviously you can take the text and there is a lot of horrible stuff objectively in there. It's absolutely true. And you can say, look how horrible this is, look how horrible that is. Boom. 'Twas always so. Except, here's the thing. No one was saying, or very few people were saying, 'twas always so until September 11, 2001.
Right.
It's only in this current era that people are going, oh my God, I just woke up. I've been sleeping the whole time. Islam has been the enemy since the dawn of the current age. Oh, I've been so fast asleep. And thank you, sir, for waking me up. BS. It's being framed, and it's easy to do so with religious texts.
Right.
Especially, apparently, the Quran, because it has a lot of violence, declarations of jihad and so on. And, the apostates and the unbelievers. To go, you see what they were saying back then? This is what they all believe now, those sneaky billion people. They're hiding it from you by saying, oh, no, we're a religion of peace. They're actually, no, they're real subconscious. And we're seeing it manifest. Look what's happening out there, these terror attacks. That's what's, they're all over a large, if 1% of them act out on the core beliefs I've just shown you of what a Muslim should believe. That's it. It's curtains for the West. It's an invasion of marauding crazy people. And the thing is, they have enough substantial evidence of manifestations to believe that. It's inviting to believe it. I understand why people fall for it. But you can't overlook 9/11, FBI false terror plots, entrapment plots, clear indications that security forces directed or encouraged or in some way helped ex-bomber, stabber into position to be there when needed for the cameras. Clear evidence that a lot of the rabble-rousers, the extreme clerics from London to Paris to Chicago to everywhere, have been on the pay of the intelligence service since the 1990s.
Mm-hmm.
They had bank accounts in London. They had ways of getting out of prison when they were actually called in for hate crime speech and stuff like that. They always got away within the course. Oh, sorry, we're going to have to ask everyone to leave the room of the courts because there's secret evidence, because this intelligence guy just gave me a file. Over and over and over. You're overlooking a lot of other evidence that is generally not talked about, but we've been cataloging over the last 2 decades. It's a pile of stuff. We can't forget it. Because we can't forget it, we can't just go, oh, right, yes. Ever since Muhammad spoke to God in a cave, down to today, it's always been there. No.
Yeah.
You cannot believe that. You can. You're totally welcome to believe it, but it's a lie.
Yep. And there's also, like I mentioned previously, there's also an Israeli agenda. I mean, I think the anti-Islam, anti-Muslim sentiment in Western countries today serves, I mean, we've talked about this previously, written about it many times, serves an Israeli agenda. And that's what people forget. People forget Israel is there in the background and has been for a long time, working its magic and keeping a relatively low profile. And if it ever talks about anything, it's about how much it's a victim and how it's the only democracy in the Middle East and how it's surrounded by a crazy horde of Muslims trying to wipe it from the pages of history. But I think the impact of Israel and its agenda in the Middle East and by extension into the rest of the Western world looms very large.
It's very significant.
And it's a nefarious agenda to destroy or, diminish or in some way, significantly degrade Islam, but not just degrade Islam, it's the religion itself, but to, as we've seen, to destroy Muslim countries and destroy millions of innocent people, basically,
At the level of mass psychology?
In Iraq and Syria and...
Yeah, there are practical geopolitical hard material reasons for it, but if you wanted to sum the whole thing in a message sense, a psychological sense, it's to get everyone else, especially our backers in the West, to see the world as we see it.
Right.
We are surrounded by a horde of crazed Muslims.
Right.
We even have a wall to keep
Right.
these guys out. We need them, Westerners,
Mhm.
to see it and feel it as we see it and feel it.
Right.
That's the mission.
Right. And I suppose my point earlier on was that it's dangerous for people to allow themselves to be manipulated in that way. Of course, there has been a lot of resistance at least from a significant percentage of the population to seeing Muslims in that light, to see them all as a bunch of evil, atavistic a horde of atavistic nutjobs attempting to overrun Western society and behead everybody, right? There's been a resistance to people adopting that extremist view of Islam. But today, when you actually have large numbers of Muslims and as part of the immigration waves coming into Europe, there's a strong tendency, I think, or a strong possibility for people who otherwise would have resisted that view of Muslims to adopt it, because it's having a direct impact on them now when they see immigrants coming into their countries, and they tend to look at maybe right wing sites and stuff who propose like this guy proposes, that Islam is a fundamentally a religion of violence that seeks to do violence to other people, etc.
Right wing sites like Breitbart.com,
Yeah.
which was literally born in a room at a meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel, which isn't to simply flame the whole thing. I like Breitbart for a lot of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
It's not black and white here.
Mm-hmm.
The other example would be the one we're talking about, jihadwatch.com. They get their funding. This is why I was distracted earlier. I was looking at them, where it comes from. The bulk of their funding is from the David Horowitz organization. He's got a number of things going. He started a think tank. David Joel Horowitz is, I suppose he's a neoconservative in the United States. He's the big funder of Jihad Watch and therefore Robert Spencer and his book.
Yeah.
This guy, he began as a hard lefty and then he went neoconservative, as so many of them did. They were bloody Trotskyites before they flipped to being neoconservatives. Even his Wikipedia page says David Horowitz, during years of labor organizing and the Great Depression, his parents were long-standing members of the American Communist Party and strong supporters of Joseph Stalin.
Right.
But that's the background of this guy.
Right. People don't understand just how enmeshed the two ideologies are. And for them to now, today, supposedly to be so clear is complete and utter nonsense. People have flipped back and forth between the two so easily, depending on whether or not it kind of rings their bell, if you know what I mean, and rings their, I suppose, their to use Jonathan Haidt's term, their moral foundations, basically, what they value, what their moral hierarchy is, you know. I mean, you see it in the US today because of Trump. I mean, because of Trump, look at Rachel Maddow, MSNBC, as one example, but you could use many others. She is supposedly an uber lefty, right? Super radical, bleeding heart lefty. You know, if you want to call it that, the worst extreme of a lefty. You know, and that any true-blooded conservative American, their blood boils when they just look at her. You know, that kind of thing. But yet you find her stridently supporting Robert Mueller, the guy who did a lot to lead us into the Iraq War,
which unleashed the migrant waves.
Right. The FBI, you know, a historically destructive organization in the US, that lefties have, you know, lefties have railed against for decades, going back to the 50s and 60s, right? The FBI, you know, setting up the the Black Panthers and all that kind of stuff, and all the malfeasance that they were involved in, and the CIA as well, instigator of coups and overthrow of secular socialist democracies around the world. Rachel Maddow stridently supports these organizations and the state infrastructure itself, right? The big banks, the big corporations. She is like loving up on them and has been for the past 2 years because Donald Trump, and she's a lefty. How do you explain that?
There was one.
Because him.
She had one lower step in the ladder, one rung to go below that, and she did it just before Christmas. Throughout the Trump term so far, there's one lefty thing she still stood by: anti-war.
Right.
And she gave away that she was anti-war because Trump in these last 2 years. Because when Trump started saying things about withdrawing troops, which we'll get on to in a minute, from Afghanistan/Syria, she was suddenly on song with the message that Trump's withdrawing the troops hurts our country and proves that he's a puppet of Vladimir Putin.
Right.
That's it. She can't go any lower. There are no more lefty credentials left in her.
She's lost them all. She's a neoconservative, basically. Put her back 10 years and she would, by espousing those views, she's a full-on neoconservative. And yet she's a radical lefty. I mean, it's just, again, we've talked about this before, but when you look at it, how that left and right divide is complete and utter nonsense, at least at the level that it's discussed, you know, and the way it's discussed in the you know, in popular discourse today. You know what I mean? I mean, and like, again, going back to the Gilets Jaunes, you see that left right divide is really only superficial when it comes down to important issues. And if people in a country can see, if most of them can see what the really important issues are and see what unites them, then they will unite. Yeah. And those left-right divides are largely irrelevant.
They need to see through. I remember now how you described it before when we talked about it. They need to see through that being a false choice is being put to them.
Right.
And the false choice is that you're conservative, ergo largely on board with the keeping the Muslim horde out. Mm-hmm. And seeing them as such. And the flip side is, no, you're left wing against the wars, which they're suffering from. Let them in, and it's a completely false choice because you're being caged to keep you from seeing the fundamental connection that these two problems, and they are problems, the simple one cause they share, which is
Right.
those guys at the
Them
top
above, yeah.
who are bringing all this shit
Right.
down on our heads.
Yeah. Because there's nothing
By
wrong.
design and by accident.
Right. I mean, the typification of, or typifying people in European countries as right-wing Nazi, Islamophobes, blah, blah, because they don't support immigration is completely erroneous for the most part. The vast majority of people who hold that view that they're anti large numbers of immigrants coming into countries do it for, and certainly in France, people who don't or against immigration are against immigration because of the financial impact on them of immigration, and especially in the context of where their own purchasing power, their own salaries, and are decreasing, and taxes are increasing. And at the same time, the government says, yes, we're going to bring in lots of immigrants that are going to cost, each one's going to cost 60,000 euros per year.
Yeah.
For someone to turn around and say, I'm against immigration on that basis, they're not a frickin' racist. They're not a frickin' Nazi. That's ridiculous to accuse them of that, and it doesn't make them right wing either.
Yeah.
Left and right people who see some sense can say, yeah, that's probably a bad idea. In the current economic climate, yeah, we probably shouldn't bring in 1 million refugees that are going to cost 60 billion euros.
Yeah.
And you can't even afford to pay us proper salaries or afford to pay proper social security benefits, etc. But the way you're demonized if you say that, they try and divide people and stop people from thinking clearly by pushing them into left, right, ideological, shame them effectively. They either encourage them to be extremists effectively, or the people who don't want to be extremists are shamed by being accused of being extremists.
Yeah, big time.
And told to shut up.
And they've done that non-stop in France. They picked out examples of protesters saying or doing or holding a certain banner and gone, boom, the headline, this is what they all are. And one of them, to give you an example, was a small group of protesters. This is after they started clamping down hard on their gatherings at the Champs-Élysées. They began to do a game of cat and mouse where they'd do a flash mob and a few would meet here and a bunch would meet there. There was one small bunch and they were all singing a song popular. I think the song was came up by the comedian Dieudonné several years ago. People would forget this now, but the sequence of events is interesting. This French comedian, well known in France, but then fired from TV because as he turned from criticizing one subgroup to another, he went on to do one of Israeli settlers, and that started his whole awakening into what was going on and why he suddenly he was allowed to make fun of everyone, but not Israeli settlers. And anyway, so he eventually came up with this hilarious routine where he came up with a song, and it's about the quenelle. The quenelle is it's a culinary dish in France, but he managed to make a lewd joke out of it, where it's something that you insert up the rear of politicians in more or less in the gesture of like this, yours. And it's a song about the quenelle, this pastry. As he went on with it and became popular, now we have the internet, and it was popularized by not just by him doing live stand-up comedy shows, but by the internet. People everywhere started doing it. They started making photos of a gesture a bit like this. This is the quenelle gesture, which is basically like how large is the pastry you would want to gift to a politician or a media spokesman or whichever doofus of the day is saying something stupid. And so people went around doing this. Oh, I give them the whole quenelle. And it became popularized, and sports stars started doing it after they were scoring goals. And it was like, we have to clamp down on this because they're mocking the crap out of us, the elites in general. Yeah. Now, they said it was, what they started twisting it was, they're doing it against the Jews because a number of the elites in France would have been Jewish. So that's an anti-Semitic thing. They actually outlawed it. It became illegal to make that gesture. So am I in trouble now for doing that? No, because I'm trying to describe it objectively. I'm not suggesting anyone get it. So screw you. They literally outlawed the gesture. And I don't know how many people actually got fined or whatever from it. But it became illegal to do it. Anyway, we fast forward a few years and a few issues later. And now we've got this national conglomerate, like the coming together of all these issues in France, from the left, labour issues, from the right, migration issues, and people are doing the quenelle of all stripes and backgrounds. And then in the media lately in France, they've had video footage. I see they're doing this. I should back up. They made it illegal because they said this was an inverted Nazi salute. So instead of people doing the Sieg Heil, they're doing it like this as a cute covert way. What they really intend is the Sieg Heil, but they're doing it downwards like this, which is a complete distortion of BS. But that made it into legislation. That became the law. That it was a fact that this is so, ergo anyone doing it's an anti-Semite.
Because it was anti-establishment basically, and they used the anti-Semitic canard to criminalize what is effectively people flipping the bird at the authorities.
Yeah,
and you're not allowed to flip the bird at the authorities.
They're cracking down on comedy. Yeah. Think of that, on a joke.
Well, yeah,
that's where we're at. Like,
but that's happening across the Western world. Like,
yes, we've seen that everywhere now. But
hate speech, etc.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On Trump, will we move on to...
Yes.
So we mentioned this in passing. Let's play a couple of videos. Trump, in his first press conference of the year, I think it was just after his first cabinet meeting, he said a few things that were really interesting. They're actually the culmination of a discussion that's been going on in the media in the US for the last few weeks, probably as a result of leaks from Trump's administration.
Mm-hmm.
But there were some other things as well. Mattis resigned, was fired, probably.
Mm-hmm.
Initially, he's going to go in February or something. Oh, he's gone. Suddenly he's gone. That's an interesting development because you remember Mad Dog Mattis was the tough pit bull that Trump brought in as his ally. Well, no, it turns out that Trump's been sparring with him big time over U.S. foreign policy. And of course, he would have done with Rex Tillerson before that. So Mattis goes. And the U.S. media ramps up the rhetoric, and we discuss Maddow saying, Trump wants troops withdrawn, ergo it proves he's a Russian puppet, because Russia wins. Well, how does Russia win? She didn't flesh out the argument, but Trump himself kind of did in his press conference about why we should be over there or not. Mm-hmm. So let's start with the Afghanistan one. They were both from the same conference, so it doesn't really matter.
We're going to do something that's right. We are talking to the Taliban. We're talking to a lot of different people. But here's the thing, because you mentioned India. India is there. Russia is there. Russia used to be the Soviet Union. Afghanistan made it Russia because they went bankrupt fighting in Afghanistan, Russia. So you take a look at other countries. Pakistan is there. They should be fighting. But Russia should be fighting. The reason Russia was in Afghanistan was because terrorists were going into Russia. They were right to be there. The problem is it was a tough fight. And literally they went bankrupt. They went into being called Russia again as opposed to the Soviet Union. You know, a lot of these places you're reading about now are no longer part of Russia because of Afghanistan. But why isn't Russia there? Why isn't India there? Why isn't Pakistan there? Why are we there? We're 6,000 miles away. But I don't mind. We want to help our people. We want to help other nations. You do have terrorists, mostly Taliban, but ISIS. I mean, I'll give you an example. So Taliban is our enemy. ISIS is our enemy. We have an area that I brought up with our generals 4 or 5 weeks ago where Taliban is here, ISIS is here, and they're fighting each other. I said, why don't you let them fight? Why are we getting in the middle of it? I said, let them fight. They're both our enemies. Let them fight. Sir, we want to do it. They go in and they end up fighting both of them. It's the craziest thing I've ever seen. I think I would have been a good general, but who knows? But you know what? These are two enemies that are fighting against each other, and we end up going in and fighting. And what are we doing?
You gotta love Trump. I think I would have been a good general, but who knows? He's right, though. I mean, it's 6,000 miles away. Why are we there? Those countries are there. There's more truth in that statement, a series of statements from an American official, never mind the president, than you will ever hear, ever.
But he's
Here.
he's ridiculed for being oversimplistic about it.
He got a few details wrong, but
No, but
the
he's
basic
ridiculed.
point
But
is-
he's not. He's ridiculed, but it's for oversimplifying it. But it is that simple.
Okay.
That's what I'm saying. He's right.
Okay.
But because Western or American foreign policy forever has been couched in these mysterious, very complex, shady terms, wars being run covertly by the CIA, blah, blah, blah. It's all very complicated, right? And the average person can't understand it. So when Trump comes out and basically calls it for what it is, it's like, that's ridiculous. No, it's because you've been bullshitted to for decades about how complicated and shady it is. The reason they do that is to keep you in the dark about how simple it is.
He's busting the lies big time. He didn't fully. I mean,
No.
a true, honest,
Yeah.
fully busting of the lies would have been, Jesus, I talked to my generals and I discovered that we are ISIS. He's not going to say that.
Right.
But think of what he is saying. Okay, so we've got troops in Afghanistan. Here's ISIS. Here's Taliban. Why are we getting in the middle of it? He probably knows why. He's seen enough now to know, or maybe he doesn't, but let's assume he does. We're in there because we need to now direct this one to be here, now direct that one to be here, now airlift this group to be here
or
to justify us
our presence.
for being here.
Yeah, for geopolitical reasons.
Yes. And the geography issue is the most simple one. It's 6,000 miles away. Russia is there. India is there. Pakistan is there. Let them sort their shit out.
Right. No, but that's anathema to American foreign policy going back for almost 100 years. That's not what America does. America gets in there. You know, it spreads its freedom and democracy around the world. You know, for obviously for imperial and imperialistic reasons. You know, but you know, Trump's agenda, Trump's messages at times have changed, and he sees this multipolar world coming up, and America's returns are diminishing increasingly, have been diminishing increasingly over the past 10 or 15 years. And he's just, from an economic perspective, he's saying he's making correct decisions, you know. But what's amazing is that, you know, I mean, people who are anti-war, you know, inveterate kind of anti-war leftists will listen to him say that.
And say he's clueless.
And the first thing they'll do is say that they criticize him for it.
Yeah.
When he's actually giving them what they've been campaigning for decades. But because
They can't
Trump,
see it.
they can't do anything about it. It's the epitome of just of I don't want to use a bad word, but it's ridiculous. These people are brain dead, effectively.
He doesn't just say the words either. He did cancel a trip, a holiday getaway on Air Force One to Mar-a-Lago, his resort in Florida. He cancelled it to stay at home and to spar with the freaking generals. I mean, he's trying something. And it's probably for the positive. Of course, it is for the positive. But people can't see it. Some people can't see it. Maybe most people, I don't know, is it most people? Let's say half, but I think it's probably the vocal minority, you know? He's basically, he couldn't be any clearer that he is against needless wars of aggression. He wants, if we're going to be fighting somewhere, he wants to believe that it's righteous. He himself, I think, feels disgust. This is beyond just the money and the... Okay, so why didn't he get the oil from Iraq? He does spit out the material, greedy, imperialistic reasons for, well, we put this much blood and booty ourselves into it, so where's the freaking return? He says things like that, which are like, Jesus Christ, who thinks like that? Well, they all do. He's just being honest.
Right.
But there's also a big element coming through of his disgust with the realization, probably crystal clear in his mind from long since before he ran for president, that we're not righteous in going around and doing what we're doing. We're not geographically there, for starters. It's not our fight.
It's not our mandate to police the world.
Exactly.
Which is the opposite of what America has been about for forever, right? The world's policeman. Yeah.
He said a variant of this in the other video we show on the topic of Syria. This has been the more discussed issue because it's more likely, it seems, that the US is on the verge of withdrawing the officially 2,000 troops it has in northeastern Syria. Same press conference. Let's have a listen.
We don't want Syria. Obama gave up Syria years ago when he didn't violate the red line. I did when I shot 59 missiles in, but that was a long time later. And when President Obama decided not to violate his statement that never crossed the red line, and then they did, and he didn't do anything about it. You know, making a threat is okay, but you always have to follow through with the threat. If you're going to make that threat, you can't make a threat and then do nothing. So Syria was lost long ago. It was lost long ago. And besides that, I don't know what, we're talking about sand and death. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about, you know, vast wealth. We're talking about sand and death. Now, the Kurds, it's very interesting. Turkey doesn't like them. Other people do. I didn't like the fact that they're selling the small oil that they have to Iran. And we asked them not to sell it to Iran. But the Kurds, our partners, are selling oil to Iran. We're not thrilled about that. Okay? I'm not happy about it at all. At the same time, they fight better when we fight with them. You know, when we send 30 F-18s in front of them, they fight much better than they do when we don't. And you've seen what's happened. But we want to protect the Kurds. Nevertheless, we want to protect the Kurds. But I don't want to be in Syria forever. It's sand, and it's death. And when we kill ISIS, if we don't, now everyone says, oh, then they'll come to our country. Well, that's possibly true, a very small percentage. But you know where else they're going? To Iran, who hates ISIS more than we do. They're going to Russia, who hates ISIS more than we do. So we're killing. And then I read when we pull out, oh, Russia's thrilled. Russia's not happy. You know why they're not happy? Because they like it when we're killing ISIS, because we're killing them for them. And we're killing them for Assad. And we're killing ISIS also for Iran.
Way to go. Way to flip the narrative on its head. He's very smart. Didn't he say he was very smart? That's Putin smart. In the sense that Putin, by going into Syria, well, to kill ISIS, flipped it and upset the whole apple cart for the globalists. That's similar to what Trump's saying there on his rationale for pulling out US troops. Mm-hmm. It's brilliant. Obviously, there's still, you know, there's only so much he said there. There's a lot that's unsaid. We're killing ISIS. Like, they're taking, you know, all the glory for clearing Syria of ISIS. Yeah, and no,
Iran.
You destroyed Raqqa in the process and Mosul, but...
And Iran and Syria hate ISIS more than we do.
Right.
What do you mean by that exactly? You mean you don't really hate ISIS that much? Or you
mean Iran has justification for having been invited into Syria to kill ISIS?
Or not only that, but we don't really hate ISIS that much at all. Because, as John Kerry said there a couple of years ago in a private conversation, that they were using ISIS to, as everybody knows, or should know, to overthrow the Syrian government.
Yeah,
using ISIS as a proxy force. And I mean, you read between the lines there, and Trump wants to stop that from happening, basically, because it's like you said, sand and death. It's there's no financial investment, and he makes reference to the financial, that his first priority is always finances in the economy. Is where, you know, they want to protect the Kurds in Syria, but they're selling their oil to Iran, and I'm trying to impose sanctions on Iran, and they're selling oil to Iran, and I don't like that, you know. So it's not ideological in that respect. It's very practical. It's economic. It's money, right?
Yeah.
But for the Washington establishment, it's all ideology. It's about controlling as much as the world as possible. It's simply about being in other countries and having as much leverage and control over the other countries as an end in itself. That's the ideology of the deep state. Mm-hmm. Control the world just for the sake of controlling the world, because we control the world.
Yeah.
And that's the ideology that anybody who basically is pushing back against Trump and hating on Trump, that's the ideology they're supporting. You know, I suppose unwittingly or wittingly, depending on who they are, but or consciously. But they, it's bizarre. It blows my mind when I see people who just can't grasp can't step back from that never Trump business and see things in a bigger picture, and you know, see the nuances and the kind of context, and also just see how fundamentally evil the Washington establishment is, and how it really does need to be stopped.
Yeah, and how tying your beliefs and your opinions to that establishment.
Yeah,
how does it not? Is there no like sense of revulsion in yourself?
Yeah.
Especially after you've said it out loud do you not stop yourself and go, hang on, I'm on the CIA side now.
Right.
When did that happen?
Yeah.
No.
Didn't I hate the CIA at one point for everything they did? No, apparently not, because Trump. It's pathetic. People are just so fickle. It blows my mind. It's pretty depressing, actually, to see how fickle people can be. Anyway, what else is going on over the past couple of weeks that we... Not much, really, was there?
Well, in the US, the government shutdown, part 17. I think it's the 17th time it's happened in the last 4 years or something.
Trump said he said that the shutdown could last forever.
He's a bit different from other shutdowns.
I can make it last forever. Like 100 years shutdown.
It's having some consequential effects. TSA workers are staying at home.
Mm.
I mean, that's a boon. That's good for the economy and good for everyone.
Good for everybody going through an airport, yeah. Especially ISIS.
But it's over the wall. Is he going to get his wall or not?
I don't know. People are freaking out about the wall. They're saying that a lot of it, a good percentage of the land that the wall will be built on is actually private land. And somebody said that to Trump, but Trump said, well, we'll just use eminent domain, which is that basically the government can force private landowners to sell their land for a government project. And totalitarianism!
Oh, suddenly they realize eminent domain is totalitarian, right? So the 100 times Obama's administration used that argument.
Right.
Crickets.
Yeah, it's pathetic.
What else? There's been more dumping of documents on this integrity initiative. That's like it's classic. Everything Russia was accused of subverting elections, of trying to get this leader,
of poisoning people,
this movement big up in whatever country in Europe,
of poisoning the Skripals,
of creating a false narrative, fake news, literal fake news, and getting it into the media. All of it emanating from this British think tank, which is now revealed was set up by British military intelligence.
British military intelligence basically made it all up and are knee deep in the Skripal case. Yeah. According to documents released about pertaining to an integrity initiative and what they've been doing, basically. We already knew that. You already knew that. That's not going to stop them one bit. Russia will be blamed for everything this year, just like last year. Yeah. So don't expect any change on that front. In fact, it's going to get even more absurd. Mm-hmm. I can see Russia getting blamed for like the weather. Yeah. Like on a serious note, not kind of, just someone spouting a tweet. I mean, government over media. Over the Christmas period, there you had a few notable transformer fires / explosions, whatever.
I remember one. There were a few.
There's one in New York.
That one I saw.
Area, and one the day after in New Orleans, and then there was another one somewhere else in a different country. But it was just interesting because it suggested some kind of weird atmospheric electrification or increased electric charge in the atmosphere, whatever, causing transformers to go kaflooey. Pretty impressive, but that's one thing. If that increases, if you have more and more of these kind of transformer fires, when the sparks running along the lines and stuff, it's totally within the realm of possibility that if a lot of in the US or in Western countries, that'll be blamed on Russia. Some kind of exotic weapon or something like that, or Russia hijacking or transformer power stations or whatever.
And there's fertile ground because people, when they see coincidences of things in rapid sequence, they tend to go, it's being done too. There's agency behind it. Mm-hmm. So they will naturally look for a scapegoat. It's like the extreme wildfires in California where they're like, oh my God, directed energy weapons. Mm-hmm. People do tend to, in this climate anyway, of basically historicized population from terrorism and extreme weather, people are already seeking out give me a scapegoat. Just give me a scapegoat. I'll take anything. And Russia is perfectly teed up for other political reasons to be the fall guy for everything from the weather to gas surges to electrical anomalies and all kinds of things. It's going to be a year of crazy stuff on that front.
I'll call it call it a day, call it a week. If you like the video, like, subscribe. We'll be back next week with another show. Until then, have a good evening.
See you next week. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.